Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC project podcast. Just as a reminder, I am doing Podmas, which is my recording of a podcast every night until Christmas. So this is installment number 10, if I'm not mistaken. I have to double check myself on that because after doing recordings every single night, it's easy to lose track of how many I've actually done. So let me see here. No, this is 11. Wow. Okay. Night 11 of recording a podcast episode a night. Basically, it's kind of wild. That is indeed a siren in the background. So as per usual, please apologize, or please accept my apologies, I should say, for all the noise. You will hear people, sirens, things like that. I live in Baltimore. It's a city. There's noise. So bear with me here. But today's episode is actually going to be another essay. It is going to be a sort of mini reading revolution, much as I did the other night with the Amiri Baraka reading Black as a Country, which I hope you all enjoyed. I've heard of it before and had never read it in full, so it was kind of fun for me as well to like learn and hear it as I was reading it out loud for the first time. That was really fun on my end, if you want to call that sort of thing fun, because obviously it's a critical piece and one that is, reflecting on Black nationalism, but also, some of the problems of defining Blackness through a narrow lens that allows people with ulterior motives, to dominate as voices or representatives of the community. So anyway, long story short, something I definitely want to revisit with Richard to talk about in a formal Reading Revolution episode. But in the meantime, on with this one, I'm going to actually read a piece by Tressie McMillan Cottom, whom she is one of, I think, the best writers of our era. And I know I laugh because a lot of people may have never even heard of her, which is wild to me. She has a podcast and things like that, and she's written several books. She wrote a really great book that did get a lot of wide acclaim, called Lower Ed. She talks about the problems of for-profit colleges and how they're predatory and things like that. A really pivotal work that everyone should check out. But she's also written a book that I thoroughly enjoyed called Thick. And it's a collection of her essays, actually, and I think it's something that many women, but especially Black women, can read and feel rather viscerally. Like every single essay in that book is just solid. And so I don't know, it just sort of, it's like as if she's in our heads, and just spitting out what we're feeling. And obviously she herself is a Black woman, so that adds to her ability to create such relatable work, but for Black women, I should say. But I think that there are aspects of it that, I don't know, just like were very personal. I felt like, oh, I've been through that. I experienced that. I experienced something very similar to that. And I think that's what makes her work, for me at least, so powerful. But I also think her work in general on issues of politics, it's incredibly useful for all people. And I don't want to say that it's just something that relates to Black women, right? She's a sociologist, she's a professor, so a lot of her writing is academic, but she does it in a way that literally makes it relatable to everyone. It's very accessible. And one of the things that I really, really appreciate about her work is the timelessness of it. So you can pick up one of her essays that she wrote 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 weeks ago, and it's still going to be something that applies in the way that she frames her arguments. And part of me wonders, in particular with regard to the essay I'm about to read, if, her work is timeless or if the problems are endless, right? If the problems are perpetual in such a way and repetitive in such a way that regardless of when she wrote something, it will apply 5, 10, 12 years later, right? And so I think in some ways, being on this hamster wheel in America of racism, violence, subtler colonialism, patriarchy, hyper-capitalists, overreach, so many things, right? There are aspects of it, of her work at least, I should say, that just feel like it applies to any time period. So the essay I'm going to read today by Tressie McMillan Cottom is actually called A Few Notes on Gaslighting. It's one of my favorite essays of hers, and one of my favorite essays, period, I think, in terms of like my history of reading. I think it very succinctly addresses so many problems that are ongoing in this country and that have a very long history in this country, in a very clearly articulated way, that anyone can kind of get down with. So I'm going to read that and I'll discuss it a little bit after the fact, and go from there. Anyway, this is A Few Notes on Gaslighting by Tressie McMillan Cottom. She wrote it on January 22nd, 2017. Okay, here we go. A few million, mostly women in the United States and abroad, marched yesterday. They marched to protest various forms of oppression, symbolized in a new presidential platform that involved explicit racism, sexism, and xenophobia. That seems like a good thing. Today, the President of the United States surrogates held several media junkets. The point of these media events? To lie about how many people did, or rather did not, attend this year's presidential inauguration. Yes, it is all very strange. What it isn't is new. Many people have used the term gaslighting to describe the new President of the United States' relationship to facts and evidence. I was around when gaslighting became a term du jour in various internet circles that talk about social movements and social justice. Basically, gaslighting is a form of manipulation through persistent denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying in an attempt to destabilize and delegitimize a target. For example, the easily proven, blatant lie that President Trump's inauguration has the largest crowds, quote-unquote, ever, period, as his press secretary claimed, would be an attempt to deny reality, misdirect public interest in the president's mandates to govern, contradict arithmetic logics, destabilize media and organizers, and delegitimize direct democratic action. Seems to fit. But again, my point is about how new is this regime of destabilization and delegitimization. I don't harp on this for ego's sake. I bring it up because I do not know how people are going to resist direct attacks on basic civil liberties if they spend an inordinate amount of time reinventing the wheel. The other side is moving ahead with politics while the opposition worries about this quote-unquote new gaslighting culture of politics. One could use all kinds of historical examples of how gaslighting works and how people have resisted it. I will use the examples most available to me because of my expertise. This isn't exhaustive. And in fact, you can find some example of what we often call hegemony in any stratified society. Hegemony is when the undue influence of a group serves your interests. Gaslighting is when it does not. If today's hegemony feels like gaslighting to you, it is probably because you've benefited from the power of undue influence over facts and rationality for a long time. For example, let's take the idea of quote-unquote race. Race is a way to stratify a society. Ergo, there must be some hegemonic power served by the creation of this social fiction. As it turns out, the fiction of biological, irrefutable, natural quote-unquote racial groups serves the interests of those at the top of that hierarchy. In our current world, that would be whiteness, the idea or concept, or white people, the persons and groups granted the privilege of that idea and concept. How could a fiction easily refuted by science, that bastion of rationality, not only persist but take on so much social power that today we talk about it being real and biological, even though we know it is not? That kind of gaslighting involved the creation of an entire language, political, and economic system. When it served powerful interests for science to justify oppression, scientists have turned evidence into fictions. Governments have rewarded these fictions with funding, backed by military dominance. And our institutions have validated them by promoting those willing to trade in these fictions as if they are facts. Rationality, or what we call it, is really a proxy for, quote, the interests of military imperialism at any given historical moment, end quote. The history is long, from phrenology to drapetomania to intelligence IQ tests to the, quote, acting white hypotheses. We make facts of fiction every day. We gaslight oppressed people every day. We tell them they are clinically insane for wanting freedom, stupid because of the migration patterns that inform their genetic code, and are bullied into poor academic performance, even when they tell you that they are not. How have racialized people, especially Black people, dealt with this kind of sustained gaslighting? I'm working on a project right now that will probably eat the next 10 years of my life. In working on that project, I'm considering the very rationality of science, especially technology, given the irrationality of quote-unquote race and racism in the information age. A few lessons from this reading. Black people continue to produce evidence-based knowledge that both advance rational science, for example, scientific method, and that also expanded its very definitions, for example, valuing experience and emotions. Black people built institutions to support, produce, and archive this knowledge. Our Black colleges, churches, neighborhood groups, Black Planet, and live journal communities are also archives. Black people took to task every race fiction socially, politically, and economically, even knowing that hegemony stacked the deck against our winning a fair hearing, outcome, or reparation. We do it for the sake of documentation, and because ethical appeals to the idea of reason matter. Black people have instituted rules of politically linked fates, making strategic alliances when necessary to exploit weaknesses in any given political context. We rescind and renegotiate those rules as necessary, often generating criticism of purity tests and inconsistencies, but political alliances are, by definition, malleable. Black people have built affirmative identities that refute fictions about our natural inferiority. Even when our quote-unquote comrades mock us for it, we have taken the idea of co-opting and repurposing language seriously because we know discourse is the grounds on which a lot of political action will happen. So yes, we change what we're called every 5 decades. We do it because hegemonic powers can co-opt our identification and use it against us. Technological advancement only speeds up the half-life of this co-option. We ignore the mocking and resist through discourse anyway. Those are some of the lessons from what I might call the original gaslighting, i.e., imperial racism. So, I think one of the most crucial aspects of this essay is just the way that it really gets at the feeling that so many people of color, especially Black people in this country, and I would say Indigenous people too, have regarding its history, and the way that history is discussed, and the way so many things that happen in the present are also discussed and framed, and the way that violence against us is legitimized, rationalized by those in power repeatedly, or those who benefit from that power structure repeatedly. I think most recently of the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, right? We saw like very strange defenses of his actions by people that we would normally have looked to perhaps in the recent past and called our allies, but who recently have made shifts into right-wing talking points and right-wing rhetoric for the sake of making a buck. And I think that it makes it clear that, sometimes the money matters a little bit more than the principles, quite a lot more than the principles that some people have. But some people are willing to sell out those who are marginalized quicker than others because they themselves are not marginalized through the same means. So making that money doesn't really come at a cost for them because they don't lose anything regardless of their public opinions. I think even when we talk about American history, American ideas of quote unquote democracy, in the process of having these discussions, some people have to catch themselves when they're talking about what's new or different or undemocratic or unusual, right? This phrase, for example, or several phrases actually that are so common in everyday speech in the U.S. are literal examples of historical gaslighting. So, for example, the idea of this is a nation of immigrants. That quotation or that saying is historically false, and it spits in the face of people who are indigenous and who were brought here, trafficked here as slaves, right? We were not immigrants. And we did not choose to come here under those circumstances, and certainly did not see it as a process of, our voluntarily helping make the nation. Even the idea of it being a nation, right, is laughable when you're talking to someone who's indigenous to this land and sees everyone here who came over as part of this quote unquote nation building process as an enemy combatant, right? As a colonizer, as someone who violated their land and their rights to exist, right? Their personhood constantly. We have other phrases like, this is not who we are, that people just regurgitate without even thinking about it and without recognizing the simple fact that this is exactly what the U.S. is, always has been. And the idea of there being a United States in the first place hinges on being exactly this, and this in this case meaning a violent, white supremacist state. That much has not changed, right? This is exactly who we are. This is how we started. This is how it has been. And even the idea of we, right? Who is this royal we? It's a royal we that doesn't include the majority of the people who are oppressed by those with power, right? This is not who we are. Excludes people like me, right? I don't have any real power in this system other than maybe voting, but even then, that's arguable in terms of the power that can exert, right? I don't see myself as part of this we in that this is not who we are, because I never saw what the we was in this case as legitimate, right? I don't see settler colonialism as a legitimate source of statehood. And so I don't see that, let's say, for example, if Americans are quote unquote behaving badly, doing things that are violent, engaging in things that involve harm to others, when we do those things but when this country does those things every day, I don't see those quote unquote bad acts as anomalies, right? It's not a surprise to me when people behave in this country in monstrous ways, because it's something that our country was founded on and that it utilizes whenever necessary in its eyes to maintain itself, to maintain its wealth, to maintain its control of the land and resources of people all around the world. And she's absolutely right when she talks about the fact that these women who are marching and talking about, how Donald Trump is such an exception to this otherwise illustrious set of records of our presidents. It's obnoxious. You know what I mean? Because how do we look at those people and see them as our sisters or as our allies or as people who are our quote unquote comrades when they're believing in historical fiction that negates our everyday reality and that negates our histories as well, right? And in tandem, it's sort of operating to negate both and to deny the reality that we live and have lived for centuries here. Right. As I'm describing this, I'm getting angry because it's frustrating because it's a constant situation where, as she says, the idea of our being gaslit, which, again, to quote her, is a form of manipulation through persistent denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying in an attempt to destabilize and delegitimize the target. It happens nonstop, and it happens from official sources, right? And happens to us from friends, quote unquote friends, right? It happens to us by people who have bought into the lie of what the U.S. promises, right? And it is frustrating because you don't necessarily, I think this is what makes her discussion of gaslighting so useful, is because like in a case of gaslighting, when you're dealing with someone who has like narcissistic personality disorder, who's abusive in some way to you, etc., you can't sit them down and say, hold on, let me explain the entire history of our relationship so you can understand why you're wrong and why what you're saying is harmful to me because it denies my suffering. That is impossible to do. We try to do it through books. We try to do it through asserting our humanity over and over to people that literally don't care. We try to do it by counteracting some of this misinformation and disinformation by teaching, hell, by having a podcast about it, right? And at the end of the day, those things only go so far. And you can only go so far as you're trying to do these things as well, as you're trying to accomplish these things. Because the moment that, I put out a podcast, let's say, correcting something that's in the media, there are tens of thousands more sources out there that are supporting it, right? That are supporting this idea of this historical fiction, whatever it may be at the time. That supports this idea that distorts reality and distorts what has happened to marginalized groups. And, I used to say a while back, like, always try to keep a few tweets on hand whenever you make like tweets related to moments in history or moments that are, that seem like very present, but will maybe make history. Kind of look back on your tweets every few months. Look back on things that you've said on social media every few months, or things that you've kind of flagged or held in your favorites or emailed a friend about, or your family member or whatever. And look back on them in a few months and see if your opinion has changed on those issues, if those issues have become more important or less important, and also how the media has operated to distort, or perhaps political figures as well, to distort what's being said in those moments, in those news items, right? Because it can be a really eye-opening experience, even if it's something as simple as a tweet from 4 or 5 months ago. And, I think also that Tressie's discussion here of race and the way race operates as such a fictional means of categorizing us, but also, again, like misdirecting us, is really important. And that's not to say, as we always have to remark, this is not to say that race doesn't have material effects. It's to say that it's amazing that something that is literally a historical fiction that's built on these ideas that are left over from, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the church and the quote unquote Enlightenment, the Middle Ages, and these wars between, continents and all of that for the Crusades. I mean, racialization started so early and just intensified with time. And yet the whole thing is a literal lie. And yet we still operate under a system that reminds us daily that those of us who are not white, and particularly those of us who are indigenous and Black in this country and elsewhere, are nothing, are less than nothing, are inadequate, inferior, incorrect, just in our existence, right? And a mistake, if you will, a blight upon, or blemish upon this nation. And we didn't choose to be here under these circumstances, right? And for indigenous people who were here from the beginning, they didn't choose to have their land invaded, and they didn't choose to die, and they didn't choose to have, all of these things, horrible, systemic, social, moral, whatever things happen to them. No one made that choice except for the people enacting that violence, and yet still putting us in these categories that we ourselves did not adhere to and did not see ourselves as, right? In a class that I'm TAing for, we read a book recently by a man named William Apess, and he was like, he's obviously, deceased now, but he was writing in the 1800s about being multiracial. So he's part indigenous, part white, and perhaps part African American as well. And he's writing about his experiences, growing up in this period of time when obviously being an indigenous person, although arguably still today, meant that he was seen as subhuman by the colonizers in many cases, or at least not as an equal to them, right? And at one point he says, rather blatantly in the text, he's like, Indian, the idea, this term Indian is a slur. It's not something in the Bible. It's not something that we called ourselves, right? It's something that's used as a means of violent categorization of us as indigenous peoples. And we have our nations. We have names for ourselves that white colonizers do not honor. And they use the idea of Indian, literally the term Indian, as a derogatory term, as an insult, as a way to slur us, right? And can you imagine? I mean, and the same can be said of the idea of Black, right? Like, yes, there are people with very dark skin. There are people with skin that is Black, literally the color Black. But ultimately, a grand majority of people who are Black come in a variety of other colors too. And this fiction of Black as opposed to white, as opposed to whatever fill in the blank, race, the idea of red for Indigenous people, these are all categories assigned to us by colonial efforts, like people involved in colonial governments, colonizers themselves, right? And we continue to use these categories to define ourselves. Now, obviously, we've gone through great pains to reclaim these ideas and reappropriate their meaning and change the meaning and use them as powerful monikers for our groups, which I think is really important and special and worth recognizing. So I'm not negating that. But I'm saying that the simple fact that we started that way by, basing these names on categories that were assigned to us and not things that we called ourselves. We were more than just those things, and yet we were reduced to those ideas and had to kind of work with them because of the circumstances. And it's, I think her line in particular where she says, hegemony is, quote, hegemony is when the undue influence of a group serves your interests. Gaslighting is when it does not. If today's hegemony feels like gaslighting to you, it's probably because you have benefited from the power of undue influence over quote unquote facts and rationality for a long time. That's one of my favorite lines in the whole text, because truly, I mean, when you talk to people and they're like, hyperventilating over the things that Republicans did or said, or that Trump did or said, for years and years at this point, obviously he's out of office, but there's still some people who are on this. It's so frustrating, right? It's not to say that what he and his cronies and his fans did wasn't wrong. I mean, it's definitely, they did a lot of bad stuff. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. But to act as if it is exceptional what they did or do is the part that's gaslighting, right? It's the part that's not recognizing the history of violence from all political parties in this country on the basis of their existing as arms, as elements of the colonial state. They're not legitimate. Nothing about it is legitimate. And yet we're forced to accept it as legitimate, and we're forced to choose between these parties that are illegitimate and that do not represent us and that continue to harm all of us who are marginalized through one way or another. It's really frustrating. And I recognize that, perhaps Tressie herself, Professor Cottom, didn't intend to take it that far, right? I know that her politics are sort of, I always kind of think of it as like liberal with grievances, right? She's liberal, but she makes really, really important commentary on where they're wrong. And I would say that she's definitely to the left of the Democratic Party, but I don't know. I don't think she's like a communist or something, right? That's not the impression I've ever gotten from her. But I think she's someone who recognizes, like, sincerely the problems with this system and constantly points them out to people, even as she exists within these spaces. And so I admire her for that, and I hope that she continues to do that, because I think people listen to her because of that. But just what I like about this essay so much is that you can take it in so many different directions, and you can apply it to so many different things that are still happening and that continue to happen and likely will keep going on and on, because I don't see things getting any better anytime soon. But I just appreciate her marking out this phenomenon and making it so plain and clear that, sometimes just daily interactions, we're being forced to reckon with the idea that not only do our lives not matter in the eyes of some people, but our histories don't either. And that our historical experiences can be so easily whitewashed and ignored and reduced to this sense of, you all are just imagining your suffering, right? You're just imagining what's happened to you. You're just not grateful enough, or you're not giving the forefathers or these people who literally pillaged the land, raped and murdered and kidnapped people, you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt, right? You're not being generous enough in your interpretation of what they had to say and what they thought. honestly, whatever they thought and had to say is garbage. It's illegitimate. How are you going to steal people and steal land and then talk about equality, being equal in the eyes of the law, or having some semblance of, you know, rights? Whose rights? How are you going to steal land and then talk about the rights that you have to live upon it and pursue happiness within it? Are you kidding me? These ideas that are seen as fundamental to this government start its problems, right? And because they constantly rely on a fiction. They rely on a fiction that this was meant to be all of our land, and it was not. It was never meant to be that. And it continues not to be that, right? It doesn't, the idea that this was a democracy for all of us continues not to be that, And I think sometimes, even people of color can fall victim to this sort of whitewashing of their own histories from lack of knowledge or just out of being brainwashed themselves, right? This idea that they can somehow benefit from these systems that have been built with their oppression in mind, as a central tenet of their existence. And I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy, but that's the truth, right? Like at some point we have to look at the truth and we have to say, what is making it, what is winning, what is doing well for ourselves in a system that exists to deny us our humanity? Do we want to be a part of that? Is that the legacy that we care about? Is this the nation that we want to call home? I know that we have very little choice in many cases, but we can fight all the way down, right? And I'm willing to say that, this is, I was born here, but this is not my country. This is not my land. This is not a place that was meant for me. This is not where I should have been, where my family wanted to be, right, historically. And I think we have to acknowledge the simple fact that it's, it's like stealing someone's house and saying, here, take the room that you want. And then not recognizing that person who sort of separated the rooms out can attack you and take that room whenever he or she feels like it. It's not your room. It's not even your house. It's not even his house, right? But anyway, love this piece. Definitely check it out. I will link it in the show notes. I think there's a lot more to be said than what I've just said, but I've already gone on for 30 minutes about it, and I think that's more than enough. I'm getting fired up, as you can see. I think it's just because it's like, I feel like all this stuff in the news recently that I've not been commenting on in the Podmas episodes, but probably should at some point. It's just like, I'm just tired. And I recognize now, I remember when I was little, and old Black people that I knew in my family, growing up, they'd be like, yeah, I don't watch the news anymore because I'm just tired. I'm tired of hearing about the same thing over and over. And I was kind of like, yeah, but you need to know what's going on. You need to like have an idea of what's up and like fight back and all this stuff. And they're just like, yeah, I'm good. Right. And I get it now. I get it. I totally get this desire to just check out, because you look at the system and you say, what good does anything that I do, how does it help change things? Am I not just like trying to, like push that rock up the hill only for it to come down again, right? It's like the forever state of Sisyphean tasks that we have to do as a society, but in particular as oppressed peoples, right? Like, I don't know. It's a lot to think about. And I promise to have lighter episodes, you guys. I know that a lot of the Podmas episodes have been kind of dark, but I think just like reading this now and thinking about things that are ongoing and yeah, just continuing to get worse and that are being done in our name, the violence that's sustained on the backs of, people, innocent people, just, yeah, abroad, here, etc. It's frustrating to see and to know that our tax dollars go to that, and our our name goes to that, right? We're being pulled along in enacting violence against people just like ourselves here and abroad, and it makes me nuts. Like, I hate it, and I wish that we were not so collectively wrapped up in saving this place, right? Like, what is there to save? What is there that's good about this? What is there to resurrect when everything burns? I don't I don't know. And I don't see this as being as something that we need to pick back up in the end. Perhaps we need to watch things burn and just take solace in that. Take solace that perhaps this experiment is finally coming to an end. I don't know. I mean, and I'm not, by the way, to be clear, like, I know some people will listen to this and think that I'm like calling for something. No, I'm just saying on a sort of purely theoretical front, right? Like, as we watch the U.S. crumble, and unfortunately, we're having to bear the burden of that further. But, you will never see me chest thumping for this country unless it's in an act of duress, right? Like, if you're putting, holding a gun to my head and threatening to murder me or something, and I say those things. But even then, there's not much that I think is worth saving here. And it's frustrating to feel that way, but it's even more frustrating when you're pointing out all of these problems and you have people who claim to be on your side saying it's not so bad, but these are exceptional times. What's happening to you all is unusual, or to happening to us is unusual, and therefore we care. And that's why they care, because it's unusual for them to go through the suffering that we've had to go through for centuries. It's unusual for them to have to confront the reality of oppression, even if it's slight, even if it's not really oppression for them, right? But any slight discomfort makes them feel as if their lives are being threatened, when it's actually our lives that have always been threatened, that continue to be threatened, and we are the ones who bear the most burden, even amongst those who in this time are calling themselves those who are suffering under the thumb of whomever, like fill in the blank leader, right? It's just, it's a lot. But anyway, read the essay if you have a chance. If you listen to it but you want to go back and reflect on it, look at the actual quotations, please see the show notes. They are there. The essays there, I should say. Take a look at that. And follow Tressie McMillan Cottom on Twitter and social media as well. She often has really interesting tweets, posts a lot of interesting articles and things like that. And sometimes it's just funny stuff. But I think she's one of those people that you can kind of look to and know that the call that she's making is one that's very well deliberated and thought about, and one that will make you think. So with that said, I hope you all are taking care of yourselves, that you're doing well, and that you have a good night. Be on the lookout, of course, for more Podmas episodes coming soon. There we go. English. Coming soon this week. Anyway, good night, everyone. Bye-bye.